Salam, peace be upon you. Let us continue our weaving from where we left off in the previous part. After excision, the world feels quieter. Not because there is less happening, but because we have finally stopped pretending we can speak everywhere. We have carved out the clean domain, the domain where our derivative words are lawful, the domain where a lift is stable, where jets can be taken without tearing the grammar. We named it plainly. D equals W minus the defect colors union the boundary colors. D is where the language lives. And now, inside that clean domain, a new kind of truth becomes possible. One that is sharper than any measurement and stranger than any story. Exact integers. Whole numbers that do not smear, do not drift, do not negotiate. But the moment integers appear, a second demand appears with them. A demand so basic that people forget it is a demand at all. If you will count, you must also choose a direction, because one is never just one. It is one in a direction. One around this way, not that way. One inward, not outward. One forward, not backward. The universe will give you integers, but it will not protect you from nonsense if you refuse to keep your signs straight. That is what Part 17 installs. Orientation conventions, the sign canon, the bookkeeping discipline that makes exact counting possible without turning mathematics into opinion. Let's begin with a picture you already know in your bones. You stand at the edge of a roundabout. Cars flow around it. If you watch long enough, you can say, without any algebra, they're going clockwise. Now imagine another person stands on the opposite side and insists, no, they're going counterclockwise. You argue, you point, you redraw arrows in the air. Then you realize the problem is not the cars. The problem is that you never established what clockwise means relative to what. Are we looking from above? From below? Are we facing the same direction? Are we using the same convention? The cars are not confused. We are. Orientation is the small act that prevents that confusion from infecting everything else. And holophase is ruthless about this, because we are about to enter the region where the universe starts returning integer answers. If we allow sign ambiguity here, we will produce fake fractions, fake anomalies, fake new effects, and we will blame reality for bookkeeping errors we introduced. So we declare the sign canon. Every loop token and every boundary token carries an orientation label. No orientation, no sign claims. That is not philosophy. That is language hygiene. Now tie it to our PS0 tokens so the rule is not merely poetic. We have phi, a map from X to the circle S1. We have local lifts phi tilde, a choice of real-valued representative of phase on lift valid patches. We have A, defined as d of phi tilde, the first derivative word of phi, the public object of change. We have excised domain D, where lifting and jets are lawful. We have loops inside D. We have boundaries of surfaces inside D. And we will soon integrate A along loops, or integrate related objects over surfaces to extract topological integers, winding, holonomy classes, charges. But an integral along a loop is not merely along the loop. It is along the loop with the chosen traversal direction. Reverse the traversal and the sign must flip. That is the entire point of orientation, to make sign flips rule-governed instead of arbitrary. If you say, the loop gives +1, you are silently saying, for this chosen direction of traversal. If you refuse to say that, you're not making a statement. You're making a mood. So part 17 is where we remove mood from mathematics. Now keep the triunity alive, because nothing in holophase gets to pretend it is just spatial. We do not have space as a primitive. We do not have time as a primitive. We do not have motion as a primitive. We have A, and from A, we read three inseparable echoes: cadence omega, texture kappa, transport nu. Those are not three independent fields. They are readouts of one object. Orientation, therefore, is not an arrow in space. It is the direction of reading of the same underlying A. When you reverse a loop traversal, you are changing how you sample the 1-5 flow, and that inevitably flips the induced sign in every readout that is derived from that sampling. The sign change is not a new phenomenon. It is the predictable consequence of changing traversal. So orientation is tri-echo in the strictest sense. It belongs to the act of reading, not to a separate ontological layer. That is the listener picture we install. The universe can count, but only if we count with a declared direction. Now we embed the gates, not as a checklist, but as a living discipline that keeps the story honest. First, the well-formedness gate. A well-formed signed claim is not "the winding is +1." A well-formed claim is on the declared clean domain D for the declared oriented loop gamma, traversed with the declared orientation, the signed integer extracted by the declared operation equals n. If any of those pieces are missing, domain, loop, orientation, operation, then it is not a sentence. It is a hint. And this is why orientation is not extra. It is part of what makes the loop token itself a token. An unoriented loop is like a verb with no subject. You might guess what it means, but you cannot certify it. Second, the invariance gate. Orientation discipline does not demand that numbers never change. It demands that changes happen only in allowed, rule-governed ways under allowed redescriptions. If we reverse the orientation of gamma, then the sign of any oriented integral over gamma flips. If we keep the same loop but change our coordinate chart on the overlap, the value of a topological integer must not change, because the integer is not a coordinate artifact. If we change the lift by adding 2 pi times an integer, we do not change A at all, so nothing derived from A by lawful operations changes. If we shift phi by a constant, the gauge quotient rule says this cannot matter to meaning. So the invariance gate has two faces here. One face says, orientation reversal flips signs, and that flip is not new physics, it is bookkeeping. The other face says, under gauge shifts, lift shifts, and allowed reparameterizations, the content that is supposed to be invariant stays invariant. Orientation covariance, in other words, the world does not change, but the sign changes because we changed how we walk the loop. Third, the domain gate. Orientation lives inside D. This matters more than people expect. Because if a loop crosses into excise territory, into sigma colors around defects, or into boundary colors near the edge, the very act of counting around becomes illegitimate. Not because counting is hard, but because our grammar was licensed only on D. A loop that crosses forbidden sets is not a loop in the language. It is a scribble. So any sign claim that ignores excision is illegal. You cannot stabilize integers by counting along paths that are not licensed. This is the deeper reason excision came before orientation. You cannot keep a clean ledger on a dirty table. Fourth, the non-encodability challenge. When someone says, I found an ambiguous sign, or I found a fractional charge, or the winding is not well defined, Holophase does not rush to invent new primitives. It asks first, did you declare orientation canon correctly? Most of the time, ambiguity is not structure. It is missing bookkeeping. So the first response is enforce orientation labels, enforce sign flip rules, enforce domain cleanliness, enforce invariance under allowed redescriptions. Then see what remains. Only what remains after this discipline is allowed to claim the dignity of a new phenomenon. This is not skepticism for its own sake. This is how you prevent the language from hallucinating. Now, to make this feel like reality rather than paperwork, we need to let the listener see how orientation is already everywhere, how it lives across scales without importing forbidden primitives. Start with the smallest possible example, a line segment. Even a simple difference from A to B has a sign. If you evaluate a change from A to B and call it positive, reversing the direction gives negative. That is the simplest orientation, ordering, the direction of reading. Holophase begins at its deepest level as the permission for comparability. Orientation is a refinement of that permission. Not only can we say different, we can say different in this direction. Now move to loops, because loops are where integers begin. You draw a loop around a point. You traverse it once. Once becomes +1 only after you decide what direction counts as plus. Clockwise or counterclockwise is not a metaphysical truth. It is a convention, and the convention must be declared for the sign of the integer to be meaningful. The integer itself, the magnitude 1, is robust. The sign is the bookkeeper's stamp. And this is exactly what we need before we can speak about winding and charge, because those are signed integers. They are not just counts, they are oriented counts. Now bring in A, because we are still in PS0. A is d of I tilde. A is a one-form-like object, a derivative word that can be paired with the direction of traversal along a curve to produce a number. When you integrate A along an oriented loop gamma, you are measuring how the lifted phase changes as you traverse. Reverse gamma and the integral flip sign. That is not a choice. That is the basic symmetry of integration. So the sign canon is not imposed from outside. It is demanded by the way the derivative word A interacts with the act of traversal. Now let the triunity echo here without naming it as independent entities. Because A is the single object from which cadence, texture, and transport are read. When you reverse traversal, you reverse the direction of reading of A, and so the sign in each projection that depends on traversal reverses in a coordinated way. The reversal cannot belong to only one projection, because the projections were never independent. Orientation is a property of the reading act applied to A, so the sign canon keeps the triacle welded. Now make it vivid with a human scale analogy that is honest and does not import forbidden tokens. Imagine you are reading a sentence in a language you know. Left to right, it means one thing. Right to left, letter by letter, it becomes nonsense. The ink is the same, the paper is the same, the symbols are the same. The only thing that changed is the direction you read. That is orientation. Now imagine the sentence is not letters on paper, but the derivative signature of phi along a loop. Read it in one direction and you get plus n. Read it in the reverse direction and you get minus n. The content is consistent precisely because the sign change is predictable. Orientation is the rule that says, if you reverse the reading direction, you must reverse the sign. That is what makes the reading meaningful rather than arbitrary. Now extend the analogy to weaving, because your project lives naturally in images of structure. A woven pattern has a direction, warp and weft. If you flip the fabric, some patterns invert. If you mirror it, left becomes right. The pattern itself is not destroyed, but the handedness can change. Holophase does something similar with loops. The loop itself, its shape, its closure, remains. But the orientation, the handedness of traversal, changes the sign of what you extract from A by integrating along it. And that sign is not a moral judgment. It is the difference between reading the warp to weft crossing one way versus the other. Now bring in the scientific discipline again so we do not drift. In holophase, we do not tolerate orientation as a vibe. We want a sign canon that is shareable between observers without smuggling in extra structure. This is why orientation must be declared explicitly in the token itself. The loop gamma is not just a subset of D, it is an oriented loop, an equivalence class with a direction label. Because if you and I compute the same integral but we quietly traverse in opposite directions, we will report opposite signs and mistakenly think we disagree about reality. In truth, we disagree about bookkeeping. A mature language does not allow that. So the sign canon is a public knowledge requirement. It is the grammatical step that turns private traversal choices into public, comparable statements. Now we should state the core rule in the simplest terms possible. A sign is not a property of the universe alone. It is a property of a universe plus a declared convention for reading. The convention is not arbitrary once declared, it is binding. And the binding rule is reverse the orientation, reverse the sign. Now we sharpen it further by installing orientation covariance as a principle of translation. When we change charts on overlaps, jets transform by chain rule. That was part 11. Meaning survives reparameterization. Orientation enters here too. If a coordinate change reverses orientation, like a mirror flip, then the sign of oriented quantities flips in the corresponding way. If the coordinate change preserves orientation, the sign stays consistent. This is not new physics. It is the translation grammar between descriptions. So part 17 is not isolated from part 11. It is the signed extension of the same insight. Meaning is in the equivalence class, not in the raw expression. Now we fold in part 16, because we must keep the sequence of the language alive. Excision created D, so our derivative tokens are defined. Orientation now lives in D, and soon in part 18, closure will create integers, winding. But closure alone is not enough. Closure plus orientation yields signed integers. That is why part 17 sits exactly where it sits, between where the language is lawful and how the language returns integers. Without orientation, winding becomes ambiguous. With orientation, winding becomes a signed invariant. Now let's make the prediction and falsifier live, but in language level terms, as required. The prediction. Most reports of ambiguous charge, ambiguous winding, or fractional sign will collapse under consistent orientation discipline. What does that mean in practice? It means that if someone hands you two computations that appear to disagree, one says +1, the other says -1, you first check if they traverse the same loop with the same orientation. If not, the disagreement dissolves immediately. The anomaly was a missing label. It also means that many apparent fractional outcomes are not fractional outcomes at all. They are averages over mixed orientation conventions, or they come from loops that are not properly confined to D, or they come from a failure to track induced orientations on boundaries. Orientation is where these mistakes hide, because sign errors are subtle. They don't explode. They mislead. So holophase turns orientation into a firewall. It prevents sign errors from masquerading as structure. The falsifier. Produce an ambiguity that persists even after explicit orientation declarations and consistent sign tracking rules on a clean domain D. This is important because it tells us what a genuine discovery would look like. If, after you have declared loop orientations, boundary orientations, induced orientation rules, after you have ensured the loop lies entirely in D, after you have ensured your invariants are cut independent and gauge clean, you still find that the sign is not well defined, then you have not found a mere bookkeeping glitch. You have found an obstruction, a place where global orientation cannot be coherently assigned, or where the object you thought was a loop is not a loop in the required sense, or where the domain has hidden non-orientability. But in PS0 language, we do not call that mystery. We call it the domain typing changed, or the topology contains an obstruction. And that prepares us beautifully for the next part, because topology is exactly where obstructions live. Now, to keep this from being abstract, let's let the listener feel the fundamental reason orientation matters. It is what separates integers from accidents. Think of a lock with a dial. You can turn it right or left. The combination is not just numbers, it is numbers with directions. Right to 10, left to 40, right to 25. If you ignore direction, you will never open the lock, and you might start blaming the lock. Orientation is the dial direction of topological counting. The universe gives you locks, closed loops, holonomy memory, winding integers. But the lock only opens if you turn the dial with the correct orientation. So the sign canon is the instruction that says, tell me which way you turned. Now we say the same thing in strict holophase terms. To extract a signed integer from phi on D, you must specify an oriented loop token. Without the token, the integer is not a well-defined output of the language. Now we add one more layer of beauty, induced orientation. A boundary inherits orientation from the surface it bounds. But we are not allowed to import a metric or a volume form. Fine, we do not need them. All we need is a convention. If a surface is oriented, then its boundary orientation is the one that makes Stokes-type sign relations consistent, wherever such relations are lawful. In plain terms, the boundary direction is chosen so that the inside is consistently on the same side as you traverse. This is still PS0. It is not geometry, it is grammar. A rule that allows different people to agree on what positive traversal means for boundaries of oriented domains. And this matters because soon, when we speak of winding and holonomy, we will talk about loops as boundaries of surfaces or as generators of homotopy classes. If boundary orientation is not fixed, then sign assignments between different but equivalent constructions will not match. And you will think invariance failed. But invariance did not fail. Your induced orientation did. So part 17 also installs, if you use boundaries, you must use induced orientation rules, or you are not speaking a certified language. Now let's keep the simplest language possible by sealing the carry-forward sentence in the story itself. Before you count, declare which way you are counting. If you reverse the way, the sign must reverse. If you refuse to declare the way, you have not counted at all. Now, because this is holophase, we will not allow orientation to become an excuse to reintroduce primitives. We do not say space has a global orientation. That would be importing a structure we did not earn. We say orientation is a convention on loop tokens inside D. It is local and declared. If global orientation exists, it is something that must be derived later from phi structure and topology, not assumed. So the sign canon remains modest. It gives us exactly what we need to speak about signed integers without cheating. Now we bridge cleanly to what comes next, without drifting into forbidden content. We have D, the clean domain of lawful derivative speech. We have A, the first derivative word. We have orientation conventions, so loops and boundaries carry signs in a controlled way. Now we are ready for the first exact integer of the language, winding. Part 18 will show that closure, when you go around and return, forces integer counts because phi lives on the circle. Discreteness will not be assumed. It will be extracted. But closure alone would give magnitude. Orientation gives signed magnitude. It is what turns one loop into +1, rather than an undefined one-ish. So we end part 17 with a seal the listener can carry as a single image. A clean domain is a clean ledger. A loop is a transaction. Orientation is the plus or minus stamp. Without the stamp, your ledger is noise. With the stamp, the universe begins to balance its books in integers. And that is the astonishing promise. Once we stop pretending we can speak everywhere, and once we stop pretending we can count without choosing a direction, reality starts returning exact, signed numbers, whole integers that do not depend on our notation, only on our honesty. We excised so the language could live. We oriented so the counting could mean. Now we can finally let closure speak. Now we can finally let the circle S1 do what circles do, turn loops into integers. And the next part begins where this one ends. The first time the universe answers the question with an exact number. Not because we forced it, but because we finally asked the question in the only grammar that cannot lie. Always. Peace be upon you.